I never thought 3 weeks could feel like a lifetime until Harper shut the door to intimacy between us, leaving me staring at the empty space in our bed every night, wondering what I had done wrong. It started with casual distance, a shrug here, a half smile there, but when she finally asked for a date night, I froze. Not out of anger, but out of something I didn't even fully understand myself at the time. My heart was a storm of frustration, hurt, and confusion, and all I could manage to say was one word: no. That single word, quiet yet heavy, set the stage for the confrontation and revelation that would shake the foundation of everything I thought I knew about our marriage. Looking back, that moment was less about rejection and more about awakening, a tipping point I couldn't ignore. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I'm Callum, a 32-year-old graphic designer living in Portland, Oregon, in a 2-bedroom apartment we had painstakingly decorated together over the past 4 years. Harper, my wife, was 30, with a laugh that once made my heart leap and a smile that could disarm anyone in the room. We weren't perfect, but we had what I thought was a solid marriage, built on shared dreams, humor, and an understanding that life had its ups and downs. But lately, I had begun to notice the small, almost imperceptible changes. Harper spending longer hours at her work-from-home job, texting more frequently on her phone, and avoiding my touch as if it carried some invisible weight she wasn't ready to share. At first, I brushed it off, convincing myself it was just stress or fatigue, that the demands of her new promotion had temporarily dimmed her warmth. But when she completely shut me out of intimacy for 3 weeks, it was no longer something I could explain away. The nights became a mixture of restless tossing and silent staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying every conversation, every slight smile, every argument we had ever brushed aside. I began cataloging my own perceived failures in my head, the way I had missed her subtle hints of stress, the times I had snapped over trivial matters, and even the moments when I had taken her for granted, thinking we were invincible. The tension built slowly, like water rising in a bathtub, and then, suddenly, the dam had broken. It all came to a head on a Friday evening. Harper walked into the living room, dressed in a soft burgundy sweater and jeans, holding 2 tickets to a local jazz show she had been hinting at for weeks. She smiled, but it was tentative, almost fragile, as though she was offering me a lifeline she had prepared herself to throw. "Callum," she said, her voice light but slightly strained. "I was thinking we could go out tonight, date night. Just the 2 of us." I felt my chest tighten, a mixture of longing and resentment clashing violently inside me. 3 weeks. 3 long, excruciating weeks of feeling invisible, unwanted, and dismissed, and now she was casually suggesting we return to normal, as if nothing had happened. I paused, looking at her with a kind of shock that I couldn't entirely articulate. My mind scrambled for the words to convey the hurricane of emotions I had been holding in, the hurt that had been simmering silently. And then, without fully thinking, the word escaped me, sharper than I intended. "No." She froze. I could see the surprise and hurt ripple across her face, and for a brief moment, the entire room felt suspended in time. The silence that followed was deafening, punctuated only by the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Harper blinked once, then twice, trying to process the sudden wall I had erected between us. I wanted to explain, to tell her that this wasn't about denying her or punishing her, but about protecting myself from the repeated hurt of being ignored. But the words stuck in my throat. Instead, I turned away, running my hands through my hair, feeling a surge of helplessness and frustration I had never known could exist in a marriage that had, for so long, felt like a safe harbor. He is. Over the next few days, our interactions became a careful dance of avoidance and tentative civility. Harper tried to engage me, suggesting dinners, movies, even a short weekend getaway. Each time, I found myself repeating the same word, not because I wanted to hurt her, but because I realized I couldn't return to a place where my feelings were being sidelined and my needs ignored. It was a revelation I hadn't expected. Standing up for myself felt terrifyingly liberating. I started reflecting on our dynamic, on how often I had compromised my comfort to preserve peace, and how often she had done the same, though in ways that left me feeling unseen. It wasn't just about the intimacy anymore. It was about respect, communication, and the emotional currency we invested in each other without always noticing. I began journaling late at night, pouring out the confusion, the pain, and the fragments of hope I still clung to. Slowly, patterns emerged in my thoughts. The subtle dismissals, the forgotten promises, the conversations left incomplete. It was painful to admit, but it was the truth I could no longer ignore. Friends and colleagues started noticing a change in me. My best friend Jordan called me one evening after noticing my somber demeanor. "Callum, you've been off lately. Something's wrong with Harper, or is it something else?" he asked gently. I hesitated, unsure if I was ready to vocalize the tension that had built to a near boiling point in my own mind. But eventually, the words spilled out. A careful recounting of 3 weeks of cold shoulders, missed cues, and silent nights. Jordan listened, occasionally interjecting with thoughtful questions, and finally said something that echoed what I had feared I would never admit to myself. "You're not crazy for feeling this way. That's a problem, and it deserves attention." That validation, though simple, felt monumental. It wasn't just about me being right. It was about finally acknowledging that the imbalance we had fallen into needed to be confronted before it broke us entirely. By the end of that first week after our date night confrontation, I had begun to feel a mix of empowerment and anxiety. Empowerment, because I had asserted my boundary and refused to acquiesce out of fear or habit. Anxiety, because I realized that this choice could fracture the life we had built if we didn't navigate it carefully. I started thinking strategically, considering how to approach Harper in a way that demanded honesty and openness without letting the conversation spiral into blame or resentment. Every night I rehearsed conversations in my mind, weighing words and anticipating reactions. I felt like a tightrope walker over a canyon of emotions, balancing the desire to repair the connection with the need to safeguard my own well-being. That tension became a kind of private crucible where I confronted my fears, my mistakes, and my expectations for our marriage. And so, the story begins. A man pushed to the edge by silence and rejection, a woman hesitant to reveal the root of her withdrawal, and a marriage hanging in a delicate balance between stagnation and transformation. Little did I know that one-word refusal, so simple, so final, was only the opening act of a journey that would force both of us to confront truths we had long avoided, to navigate uncomfortable realizations, and to question whether love alone was enough to bridge the growing chasm between us. It was a beginning, and it was terrifying, but it was also undeniably real, the first step in a story that neither of us could walk away from. Before the silence and the tension settled into our lives, Harper and I had what most people would call a picture-perfect marriage, or at least that's what we tried to show the world. I was Callum, the graphic designer whose work often kept me tethered to my laptop until late at night. But I prided myself on being attentive, humorous, and thoughtful. Harper, in her mid-30s, was a marketing strategist who thrived in high-pressure environments, and yet she had this effortless warmth that drew people toward her. Together, we had built routines and rituals that made our relationship feel comforting, almost predictable. Saturday mornings were for pancakes and long, lazy walks through the city's Riverside Park. Evenings often meant movies on the couch or experimenting with new recipes, sometimes laughing so hard that we nearly spilled the wine. These moments, though ordinary to the outside eye, were our glue, our evidence that we could coexist in a world that often demanded so much of us. It was easy to forget, however, that beneath the surface of these routines lay subtle tensions we didn't always confront, small disagreements brushed aside, unmet expectations tucked neatly into the corners of our hearts. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I remember one Sunday in particular, months before the 3-week silence began, sitting on the balcony with Harper, sipping coffee and watching the fog roll off the Willamette River. She leaned her head on my shoulder, and I felt that familiar warmth, the way her presence made the world seem smaller, quieter, safer. "Callum, sometimes I worry we're just existing in routines," she said, her voice thoughtful. I laughed it off at the time, joking that routines were what kept life sane. But in hindsight, that small comment was a precursor, a subtle warning that underneath our daily rituals, cracks were beginning to form. We had been so busy managing careers, bills, social obligations, and the endless notifications of modern life that our emotional intimacy had been quietly eroding. We hadn't noticed, or perhaps hadn't wanted to, that our connection required more than laughter over pancakes or synchronized binge-watching. It needed attention, reflection, and open conversation, none of which we were fully prepared to offer each other consistently. Harper was also incredibly ambitious. Her promotion to a regional manager role at her firm had been a source of pride for both of us, yet it brought new pressures she didn't always articulate. She began spending long hours on Zoom calls, her phone glued to her hand, and even weekends were punctuated by work notifications. I tried to be understanding, reminding myself that her success was something to celebrate. Still, the emotional withdrawal that accompanied her career focus started to manifest in subtle ways. A delayed response to a good morning text, a distracted smile when I told her about my day, or a quiet sigh when I suggested plans for the weekend. Initially, I interpreted these as fatigue or stress, but over time, they accumulated like small drops in a bucket, each one making the emptiness between us feel heavier. I found myself longing for the spontaneity we had shared during our early days. Impromptu dinners, late-night drives, shared laughter over silly mistakes. But those moments became increasingly rare, replaced by a quiet, persistent tension that neither of us seemed able to name. The apartment itself reflected the paradox of our lives, meticulously decorated, comfortable, and aesthetically pleasing, yet cold in its emotional atmosphere. We had put effort into making our space beautiful, abstract art on the walls, plants that thrived despite my neglect, cozy throws on the couch. But the warmth that once came effortlessly between us had begun to feel manufactured. I started noticing little signs of detachment that I could no longer ignore. Cups left half-drunk on the counter, jackets tossed carelessly instead of hung up, a door closed too firmly or too slowly. These mundane details, which might have seemed insignificant to an outsider, began to feel symbolic, like markers of distance and disconnection. They weighed on me quietly, creating a constant undercurrent of anxiety that no amount of planning or distraction could entirely dispel. Despite these growing tensions, Harper and I still shared moments that reminded me why I had fallen in love with her. I remember an evening just weeks before the silence began, when we cooked dinner together, her chopping vegetables while I stirred the sauce, and ended up laughing over an accidental spill of red wine across the counter. For those brief moments, I felt like us again, connected and alive. But those flashes of connection became more sporadic, leaving me yearning for stability in a marriage that felt increasingly unpredictable. I would lie awake at night, replaying conversations in my mind, questioning my own responses, wondering if I had failed to notice her needs, and simultaneously fearing that she had failed to notice mine. The emotional labor of sustaining a marriage had always been a shared responsibility, but the balance had begun to tip quietly in ways I didn't fully recognize until the 3-week stretch of silence forced me to confront the gaps. Our social life reflected the same pattern. Friends noticed that we weren't as engaged as we used to be at gatherings, that our smiles seemed forced, and that our conversations rarely touched the depth they once had. Invitations to events were often declined, not out of disinterest, but because Harper or I simply didn't have the energy, or perhaps the desire, to navigate the performative aspects of socializing. Yet beneath it all, we both craved affirmation, intimacy, and reassurance that our bond was still strong. The irony was that while we both wanted closeness, our inability to communicate effectively had built an invisible barrier, one that manifested most painfully in the physical and emotional distance that defined those 3 weeks. Hocha, it wasn't that our marriage was failing in the conventional sense. We weren't fighting constantly, nor were we strangers living under the same roof. Instead, the problem was quieter, more insidious. We had fallen into a pattern of avoidance, of unspoken expectations and unmet needs. The apartment, our routines, and even our smiles were a veneer, hiding the slow accumulation of dissatisfaction that neither of us wanted to confront. I was Callum, a husband who loved deeply but had begun to feel invisible. Harper was the ambitious, loving partner who carried her stress silently, unaware that her withdrawal was amplifying my own sense of neglect. And together, we were teetering on the edge of a reckoning we could no longer postpone, a confrontation that would force us to examine the truth of our connection, our choices, and whether the love we had cultivated was resilient enough to endure the strain. This was the foundation, the baseline situation, the normal, from which everything would soon shift. The stage was set. A marriage built on love, but strained by silence, ambition, and unmet expectations. Two people who cared deeply yet struggled to bridge the growing gap. And a story that was about to unfold with all the emotional intensity, confrontation, and revelation that neither of us could have anticipated. From here, every small decision, every withheld word, and every act of self-preservation would ripple outward, ultimately shaping the choices that would define the future of our relationship. Looking back, it all began on a crisp autumn evening in downtown Portland, a night that seemed ordinary but ended up shaping the trajectory of our relationship. Harper and I had only been dating for a few months, and the world felt like it had conspired to bring us together. I remember noticing her first at a local art gallery, standing beside a vibrant abstract painting with a glass of red wine in hand. She had an aura of quiet confidence, the kind that draws you in without demanding attention. Our eyes met, and I felt an unexplainable pull, a sense that this was the start of something significant. She smiled, not in a rehearsed or casual way, but genuinely, the kind of smile that lingers in your memory long after the moment has passed. From that instant I was captivated, and, little did I know, she felt something similar. That night, after the gallery had closed, we wandered the streets of the city, sharing stories about our childhoods, our dreams, and the quirks that made us who we were. Everything felt effortless. There was a rhythm to our conversation, a natural alignment that made hours pass like minutes. Our first date officially followed the gallery encounter, a small cafe tucked away in an alley, where the aroma of freshly baked bread mingled with the earthy scent of roasted coffee beans. We talked endlessly, our conversation flowing from trivial topics to profound reflections on life. Harper laughed easily, a melodic sound that seemed to echo through the room, making even the baristas glance our way. I, usually reserved and cautious with my heart, found myself opening up in ways I hadn't in years. We shared childhood stories, secrets about embarrassing moments in school, and dreams that, at the time, seemed distant and almost unattainable. That first evening was the foundation, a glimpse of compatibility and connection so strong that both of us instinctively recognized its rarity. I walked her to her car that night, and when she leaned in for a soft, lingering kiss, I felt a sense of certainty that this was a relationship worth investing in, one that had the potential to change my life entirely. In the following weeks, the rhythm of our relationship developed naturally, almost as if we had rehearsed it in some previous life. We explored Portland together, from the quirky shops in the Pearl District to quiet corners of Forest Park, where the sunlight filtered through the trees in golden streams. We experimented with cooking meals together, sometimes disastrously, sometimes memorably, but always with laughter and a sense of shared adventure. Harper introduced me to her friends, and I did the same, and it was remarkable how easily we blended into each other's worlds. There were moments, small yet significant, that revealed her caring nature. The way she remembered little details about my family, the books I had mentioned in passing, and even my favorite kind of coffee. It wasn't grand gestures that defined the beginning of us. It was consistency, attentiveness, and the genuine curiosity we had for each other's lives. That early phase of the relationship was intoxicating because it felt like discovery. Every conversation, every glance, every touch revealed something new, creating a tapestry of trust and affection. Our compatibility extended beyond the surface. Harper and I shared similar values about honesty, loyalty, and personal growth, but we also challenged each other in ways that sparked both excitement and reflection. I recall a debate we had one rainy evening about career priorities versus personal happiness. Instead of arguing to win, we listened, probed, and genuinely considered the other's perspective. That kind of engagement wasn't common in my previous relationships, and it impressed me deeply. It was during those conversations that I started envisioning a long-term future with Harper, an image that felt natural and sustainable, as if it had been waiting for both of us to recognize it. We weren't just infatuated. We were building the foundations of understanding, communication, and shared dreams, which, at the time, made the future seem almost inevitable. Of course, no beginning is without its subtle warning signs, though they often go unnoticed in the early glow of attraction. Harper, as ambitious and driven as she was, sometimes carried stress silently, masking tension behind a serene smile. I, too, had my own hesitations, an undercurrent of insecurity that made me second-guess whether I was truly capable of being the partner she deserved. But at the time, those little hesitations were overshadowed by the euphoria of discovery and connection. We overlooked the occasional disagreements, brushed past minor misunderstandings, and focused on the elements that drew us together: laughter, intimacy, and a shared vision of what we wanted life to look like. Looking back, I realized that these early moments were critical in establishing patterns that would later define the dynamics of our marriage, the ways we communicated, avoided conflict, and expressed affection, all of which carried into our adult relationship with consequences we didn't foresee. It was also during those first months that physical intimacy began to play a significant role, though it was never rushed or forced. Harper and I shared tender moments, playful teasing, and passionate embraces that deepened the emotional connection we were already building. Each encounter felt like a mutual discovery, a shared language of trust and desire. This phase taught me that intimacy wasn't just about the physical act. It was an extension of emotional closeness, a way to reinforce the bond we were carefully constructing. The consistency of attention, affection, and curiosity set a tone for the relationship, a standard that both of us unconsciously relied upon in the months and years to come. By the time Harper and I officially moved in together, nearly a year into our relationship, the foundation felt solid. Our routines, our communication style, and our mutual respect had created a sense of security, and even when small disagreements arose, they were manageable, because the trust and intimacy we had built early on provided a buffer. Yet, the very patterns that had supported us in the beginning, our routines, our ways of coping with stress, and our methods of expressing love, also planted the seeds of later challenges. It was easy to assume that because things felt right then, they would remain right indefinitely, without realizing that growth, stress, and life's inevitable pressures could strain even the most seemingly perfect foundation. And so, the story of our relationship began, not with grand gestures or dramatic conflicts, but with subtle alignment, shared curiosity, and an emotional rhythm that made everything feel inevitable. Those early days defined our expectations of love, intimacy, and communication, shaping the lens through which we would later interpret silence, distance, and unmet needs. Little did we know, the very connection that had felt effortless would be tested in ways we never imagined, forcing both of us to confront truths about ourselves and our marriage that the beginning had only hinted at. Ugless. Once our relationship transitioned from dating into a steady marriage, the good times began to define us, creating moments so vivid and warm that, even now, they stand in stark contrast to the cold silence of the weeks that would come later. Harper and I had settled into a rhythm that, at the time, felt effortless. Mornings spent sharing coffee and newspapers, evenings cooking together while laughing over minor mishaps in the kitchen, weekends devoted to exploring new neighborhoods or hiking trails around Portland. Life had its usual stresses, of course, but the intimacy we shared, both emotional and physical, made those pressures manageable. On Saturday mornings, I would wake up early to brew her favorite hazelnut coffee while she lingered in bed, reading a novel or scrolling through photography blogs she adored. The aroma of coffee would drift through the apartment, and soon she would emerge, wrapping herself around me in a hug that felt like a soft shield against the world. Those mornings were ours, private sanctuaries that reminded me why we had chosen each other, and why, despite challenges, the foundation of our bond felt unshakable. One of my favorite periods of our marriage occurred during the spring of that year, when Harper suggested we take a weekend trip to Cannon Beach, a small coastal town just a few hours from the city. It was spur of the moment, a spontaneous decision born out of a shared craving for escape and fresh air. The drive itself was an adventure. Windows down, music low but steady, laughter spilling easily from the car as we recounted stories of childhood mischief, work disasters, and random what-if scenarios that always seemed funnier when shared. When we arrived, the coastline stretched before us, gray waves crashing against jagged rocks, and the salty air felt like freedom incarnate. We walked hand in hand along the shore, occasionally daring each other to kick up more sand or splash in the frigid water, and even when the wind whipped our hair across our faces, it only made us laugh harder. That weekend wasn't just an escape from routine, it was a crystallization of our connection, a moment where the simplicity of shared joy and physical closeness affirmed why we had chosen to commit to each other in the first place. Intimacy during this period wasn't merely sexual, it was woven into the minutiae of daily life. Harper would leave little notes on the counter, reminders that she noticed, and appreciated me. I would return the gesture by filling the dishwasher for her, even though she could do it herself, or leaving small doodles on sticky notes for her to find later. There was a rhythm to our days that reinforced the emotional bond. Cooking together, sharing playlists, watching movies we both loved, and simply talking about our hopes for the future. I felt a sense of security, a belief that no matter the external pressures, work deadlines, family responsibilities, financial worries, we had each other to anchor our lives. Even disagreements, when they arose, were handled with patience, a willingness to listen, and a genuine desire to reach understanding rather than victory. These were the moments that made the later weeks of silence feel so disorienting. The memory of warmth, laughter, and closeness became both a comfort and a reminder of what was at stake. Socially, we thrived together. We hosted dinners for friends and family, taking pleasure in crafting meals that were equal parts delicious and intimate. Harper had a knack for creating welcoming spaces, decorating the table with fresh flowers, and arranging lighting to create a cozy atmosphere. I would handle the music, curating playlists that perfectly matched the mood. Our friends often commented on the energy between us, the easy laughter, and the subtle gestures that spoke of a deep, unspoken understanding. It wasn't just about appearances. It was about the authenticity of our bond and the way we navigated life as partners. Those interactions reinforced our sense of partnership, giving me confidence that we were not just lovers, but a team capable of supporting one another through joy and adversity alike. One evening, I recall Harper and I celebrating her birthday in a small, candlelit restaurant tucked away in a quiet street. She was radiant that night, her hair catching the soft light, her eyes shining with happiness. We shared a bottle of wine, talked about her career achievements, and reminisced about the early days of our relationship. At one point, I reached across the table and squeezed her hand, and she smiled, a quiet smile that said more than words ever could. "I feel lucky," she said softly. I responded instinctively. "We both do." And it was true. We had built something that felt rare. A marriage that wasn't perfect, but was mutually nurturing, full of laughter, shared dreams, and genuine care. That night, as we walked home under a sky sprinkled with stars, I felt a sense of completeness. A reassurance that despite life's inevitable challenges, our love could withstand them. During this period, even work stress and personal challenges seemed manageable because of the support system we had created for each other. When Harper faced tough deadlines or demanding clients, I became her sounding board, offering perspective, encouragement, and humor to lighten her load. Similarly, when I encountered creative blocks or stressful presentations, she provided patience, advice, and unwavering belief in my capabilities. These shared experiences strengthened our bond, teaching us the value of empathy, compromise, and emotional resilience. The good times weren't just pleasant, they were instructive, providing a blueprint for what it meant to be partners not only in love, but in life itself. Yet, even amidst these joyous moments, small signs of tension began to surface, subtle enough to be ignored at first but persistent enough to leave a lingering unease. Minor arguments over trivial matters occasionally sparked, like disagreements about scheduling or household chores. They were always resolved quickly, but they planted seeds of doubt, small reminders that relationships require constant attention and negotiation. Still, the warmth of our good times overshadowed these minor frictions, making them feel more like bumps in the road than signs of an impending storm. Those periods of happiness, though, were crucial. They showed me what was possible in a marriage, and they created emotional stakes that made the coming weeks of withdrawal, silence, and confrontation feel all the more intense and disorienting. The good times were not just memories. They were the foundation that made our later struggles feel real and consequential. The laughter, intimacy, shared adventures, and mutual support all contributed to a sense of partnership that, when disrupted, left a vacuum that hurt more deeply than I had imagined. Looking back, these moments of joy and connection were the lens through which I would later interpret Harper's withdrawal, the high watermark that made me realize what was at stake, and the emotional anchor that reminded me why I couldn't walk away, even when things became unbearably difficult. Even during the period of our so-called good times, there were subtle moments, almost imperceptible at first, that hinted at cracks beneath the surface of our marriage. They weren't dramatic. They didn't involve shouting matches or major betrayals, but they were enough to leave a quiet unease that I, in my naivete, chose to overlook. It started with small changes in Harper's behavior. Things that at first seemed trivial, but over time, formed a pattern impossible to ignore. She began spending more time on her phone, her eyes darting toward notifications with a frequency that felt obsessive. I remember one evening in particular. We were sitting together on the couch, watching a documentary she had been excited to see, and instead of being fully present, she constantly checked her phone under the blanket, her thumbs scrolling messages that she wouldn't share with me. I didn't confront her then. I told myself she was just waiting for an important work update, but the pang of suspicion lingered in my chest like a quiet drumbeat I couldn't quite shake. Other warning signs followed, each one minor in isolation but cumulatively unsettling. Harper, who had once been physically affectionate without hesitation, began creating subtle distance. Hugs were shorter, touches less frequent, and the casual brushing of hands during daily routines became infrequent enough to feel noticeable. At first, I rationalized it. Stress, fatigue, perhaps she was feeling under the weather. But the consistency of these small acts, repeated almost ritualistically, suggested a pattern I could no longer ignore. Even casual conversations began to feel strained. Her responses became clipped, polite, but distant, often ending abruptly when I attempted to probe deeper. I found myself questioning whether I had done something to upset her, replaying past interactions in my mind, searching for a hidden slight or forgotten argument. Each day, the unease grew, a quiet whisper in the back of my mind warning me that something was off, though I couldn't yet name it. Work also became an increasingly prominent factor in her life, though the shift was subtle at first. Harper had always been ambitious, but suddenly, her career appeared to take precedence over almost everything else. Meetings that once concluded on time stretched for hours. Weekend tasks began creeping into evenings. Lunch breaks were sacrificed for client calls. I supported her, encouraged her, even marveled at her drive, but a seed of resentment began to take root. It wasn't about her success. It never was, but about the quiet erosion of shared time. The moments I had come to cherish that now seemed sacrificed without acknowledgement. I started noticing the impact on our routines. Our Saturday morning walks were canceled, our impromptu cooking sessions reduced to quick meals eaten in silence, and even our shared laughter became less frequent, punctuated by sighs and half-smiles. There was also a subtle shift in our emotional communication. Harper, once open and forthcoming about her thoughts and feelings, began holding back, offering vague explanations when I inquired about her day or her mood. I remember one evening when I asked if something was bothering her after she had returned from a particularly long day at work. She smiled faintly, a practiced expression of calm, and said, "It's nothing, Callum, just tired." But her eyes betrayed her, a slight narrowing, a flicker of tension that contradicted her words. I wanted to press further, to demand honesty, but I hesitated, unsure if pushing would create conflict rather than clarity. I learned, even then, that silence could be more dangerous than confrontation, because it allowed doubt and uncertainty to fester in the absence of truth. The first tangible warning sign of the emotional distance manifested in a way I will never forget. A small disagreement over something mundane, like whether to go out for dinner or cook at home. Harper had suggested a new restaurant, one she had been excited to try, and I had declined, citing fatigue from work. The response I received was not the usual playful banter or gentle negotiation we had shared in the past. Instead, she frowned, her voice unusually sharp, and muttered, "Fine, whatever," before retreating to her room without another word. It wasn't the disagreement itself that shocked me. It was the sudden withdrawal, the silent storm behind her eyes. That night, I lay awake, listening to the faint hum of the city outside, realizing that this was different from anything we had experienced before. The emotional wall that had begun forming was now visible, and I could feel the weight of its presence pressing down on both of us, making every subsequent interaction more tentative, more cautious, and more fraught with unspoken tension. Friends and family began noticing subtle changes as well, though none were able to fully articulate the situation. A weekend brunch with Harper's sister, for example, became a delicate dance of smiles and superficial conversation, as Harper and I navigated the invisible tension between us. When her sister complimented Harper on her recent work accomplishments, Harper's eyes flicked toward me for reassurance, almost unconsciously seeking validation in my gaze. That tiny moment, almost imperceptible, spoke volumes. She was aware of the growing distance and perhaps felt guilt or uncertainty about it. Meanwhile, I was caught in my own swirl of frustration, hurt, and confusion. desperately wanting to reconnect but unsure of how to breach the growing divide without exacerbating it. By the third week of these small warning signs, the emotional climate of our home had shifted noticeably. Laughter became sparse, conversations shallow, and shared routines hollow. Even when we were physically together, I could feel the distance in the space between us, a subtle yet persistent reminder that something essential had been disrupted. Every glance, every half-hearted smile, every postponed plan was a signal I could not ignore, a quiet alarm bell that the foundation we had built during our good times was under threat. I sensed that this was more than a passing phase or stress-induced distraction. It was a deeper, more fundamental challenge, one that demanded acknowledgement and confrontation if it was ever to be resolved. And so, the first warning signs were clear, though easy to dismiss if one chose to ignore them. They were small gestures, clipped words, and subtle withdrawals that foreshadowed the emotional struggle to come. At the time, I didn't fully grasp the significance of these moments, assuming they were minor and temporary, but looking back, they were the first hints of a storm that would soon engulf us. These warnings, once unnoticed or rationalized, became impossible to ignore, setting the stage for the confrontation and ultimate reckoning that lay ahead. A reckoning that would test not just the strength of our marriage, but our ability to communicate, trust, and truly see each other as partners. As the warning signs persisted, the subtle unease in our marriage began to swell into something more tangible, more consuming, until it became impossible to ignore. Those small gestures of withdrawal, clipped responses, distant glances, and delayed replies began to compound, forming an emotional wall that neither Harper nor I knew how to dismantle. It was no longer a matter of minor tension. The atmosphere in our apartment was thick, with unspoken frustration and quiet resentment. Even mundane interactions carried the weight of accumulated grievances, and what once felt like a partnership now felt like a negotiation for attention, validation, and emotional presence. It started to infiltrate our daily routines, turning small tasks into sources of conflict. Simple decisions: what to have for dinner, whether to attend a social event, or which household chore to tackle, became arenas of subtle friction, each disagreement leaving behind a residue of tension that neither of us could shake. The emotional distance began to affect the most intimate aspects of our relationship. Harper, who had once welcomed physical closeness with ease, now seemed guarded, almost defensive, in moments that previously would have felt natural and comforting. I remember one night, lying beside her, reaching for the warmth of her hand only to have her pull back slightly, tucking herself beneath the blanket with an almost imperceptible sigh. I froze, the familiar surge of hurt and confusion washing over me, and for the first time, I began to question whether our connection could survive this growing detachment. The 3 weeks of denied intimacy had already created a chasm between us, but now even the tentative gestures of affection that once reassured me were being withheld. It was as though a silent barrier had formed, one that neither of us had acknowledged openly, but which both of us felt with relentless clarity. Work stress intensified the problem. Harper's responsibilities at her firm had multiplied, and her energy was consumed almost entirely by client demands, reports, and meetings that stretched long into the evenings. While I understood the importance of her career, the imbalance in attention and emotional investment became more pronounced. Even when we were physically present together, her mind seemed elsewhere, an invisible tether pulling her toward obligations beyond our home, leaving me to navigate the growing emptiness alone. I began to notice the subtle signs: her tapping fingers while checking emails during dinner, the distracted hum of her laptop while I attempted to engage her in conversation, the frequent sighs that punctuated our otherwise mundane interactions. Each instance chipped away at the stability we had painstakingly built, creating an emotional friction that left us both wary of initiating connection. Arguments became more frequent, though still often subtle and passive-aggressive. Minor disagreements escalated quickly, fueled by weeks of pent-up frustration and unspoken disappointment. I recall one evening when Harper suggested rearranging the furniture in our living room, something she had wanted to do for weeks. I initially resisted, citing the exhaustion of the week, and her reaction was unexpectedly sharp. "You never want to do anything I suggest," she snapped, her voice tighter than usual. I, in turn, felt defensive, the frustration that had been simmering beneath the surface finally bubbling over. What began as a simple discussion about furniture turned into a tense conversation about emotional neglect, missed attention, and unmet expectations. Neither of us had intended for it to reach that level, but the accumulation of unresolved issues made every interaction a potential flashpoint. Even our friends began to notice. Casual brunches and dinners became uncomfortable, as Harper and I navigated the tension with strained politeness, laughter that felt forced, and glances that betrayed silent arguments. Friends would later comment on the change, though no one could articulate the depth of the growing emotional distance. It became painfully clear that the challenges we faced weren't limited to private moments. They were seeping into the very fabric of our social lives, altering the way we engaged with the world and with each other. I began to feel isolated, not entirely by choice, but because the emotional weight of our unresolved tension made every conversation feel like a balancing act. I wanted closeness and reassurance, yet I also feared initiating contact that might be rebuffed or misinterpreted, creating a cycle of avoidance that intensified the distance. Physical intimacy, already strained, deteriorated further. Harper's withdrawal wasn't just occasional or situational. It became a pattern, a consistent lack of engagement that made each attempt at connection fraught with uncertainty. When I tried to initiate closeness, her responses were minimal, almost perfunctory, leaving me frustrated and, at times, hurt. It was not malicious. I sensed that she too was struggling, caught between her own stressors, expectations, and unspoken feelings. Yet the result was the same: nights of loneliness, silent tension, and a growing sense that our marriage, though outwardly intact, was in peril. I found myself lying awake, replaying conversations and encounters in my mind, analyzing what had changed, and wondering whether there was a way back to the intimacy and warmth we had once shared. The stress eventually spilled into our interactions at home. Even casual conversations became loaded with subtext, each word weighed against unspoken grievances. Simple tasks like doing the dishes or planning a weekend outing became moments of negotiation, where every decision seemed to require compromise and vigilance. Small annoyances, misplaced keys, forgotten emails, unfinished chores, were magnified, interpreted as signs of disinterest or disrespect. Our home, once a sanctuary of comfort, began to feel like a battleground, and the emotional exhaustion that accompanied each interaction created a sense of inevitability. Unless we confronted the underlying issues, the emotional rift between us would only widen. By the end of those weeks, the cumulative effect of withdrawal, miscommunication, and unaddressed stress had transformed our lives. The apartment felt heavy with tension, our conversations short and cautious, our interactions punctuated by unspoken frustrations. We were two people, deeply invested in each other, yet trapped in a cycle that neither of us knew how to break. Every glance, every hesitation, every silent dinner reminded me that the love we shared was being tested in ways that went beyond mere inconvenience. It was a struggle for recognition, understanding, and connection, a challenge that would soon demand clarity, confrontation, and perhaps the most difficult choices either of us had faced in our lives together. By the time Harper and I had reached the point of sustained tension and emotional distance, I realized that trying to navigate the storm alone was no longer sufficient. The growing silence between us had begun to infiltrate every aspect of our lives, and I could feel the weight of uncertainty pressing against me like a physical force. I knew I needed perspective from someone who could offer clarity, someone who could validate my feelings without judgment. It was then that I reached out to my closest friend, Jordan, a longtime confidant who had known me long before Harper entered my life. Jordan had a rare ability to listen without immediately offering solutions, which was precisely what I needed. Sitting in his living room, recounting the recent weeks of emotional withdrawal, clipped responses, and denied intimacy, I felt a mixture of relief and vulnerability. Speaking aloud, the frustrations I had been holding inside for so long made them feel real in a way I hadn't fully allowed myself to acknowledge. Jordan listened intently, nodding at moments that resonated with him, asking questions that encouraged me to clarify my own perceptions. "It sounds like Harper's distance isn't just about stress," he said at one point, his voice calm and steady. "It's affecting you, Callum. You deserve to be seen, to be heard, and to feel wanted in your relationship." Those words, simple as they were, struck me profoundly. I had been second-guessing myself, rationalizing Harper's withdrawal as a temporary lapse or a stress-related phase, but Jordan's perspective illuminated the truth I had been avoiding. My feelings were valid, and the pattern we were experiencing was not normal or acceptable in a healthy marriage. For the first time in weeks, I felt a measure of external confirmation, an acknowledgement that my discomfort wasn't imagined or exaggerated. Encouraged by this validation, I began seeking additional perspectives, cautiously sharing my concerns with other close friends and even a trusted colleague who had experience with relationships and counseling. Each conversation reinforced the understanding that I was not alone in recognizing the imbalance, and that my desire for honesty, intimacy, and mutual respect was not unreasonable. One evening, over coffee with my colleague Amanda, I explained the series of events and my growing frustration with Harper's emotional withdrawal. Amanda leaned back, her eyes thoughtful, and said, "Callum, it's not just about what she's doing. It's about the space she's allowing between you two. Relationships can't thrive on silence and avoidance. You need to address it before it becomes irreparable." That perspective resonated deeply, reinforcing the urgent need for clarity and action. The external validation extended beyond conversations. It also came in the form of subtle feedback from people who had observed Harper and me together. During a casual gathering at a mutual friend's house, one friend commented on the noticeable tension between us, asking gently if everything was okay. Initially, I felt defensive, reluctant to admit the emotional strain we were experiencing. But as I reflected on the observation, I realized it was true. The disconnection was visible, even to outsiders, and the acknowledgement of it from someone without a vested interest carried a weight I could not dismiss. It was a reminder that the issues we were facing were not private inconveniences to be brushed aside. They were real, significant, and deserving of attention. Even my family, whom I typically tried to shield from the internal dynamics of my marriage, began to offer subtle insights. During a brief weekend visit with my parents, my mother, perceptive as ever, noticed the tension in Harper's quiet demeanor and my own subdued responses. She didn't press for details, but her gentle probing and calm presence encouraged me to articulate what I had been struggling to express fully. "Callum," she said softly, "sometimes the people we love need reminders, but we also deserve to be reminded of our own worth. It's okay to notice when things feel off, and to act on it." That maternal perspective, coupled with the observations and guidance of friends and colleagues, created a network of external validation that helped me crystallize my understanding of the situation. I began to see patterns I had been hesitant to acknowledge: the consistent withdrawal, the clipped communication, the avoidance of intimacy, all indicators that our marriage was straining under unaddressed tension. Perhaps the most pivotal aspect of this external validation was the realization that seeking input did not equate to betrayal or weakness. On the contrary, it became a source of strength, providing me with insight and clarity that I could not generate alone. Each conversation, each observation, and each word of encouragement reinforced the understanding that my feelings were legitimate, that the situation required attention, and that taking action was not only justified but necessary. I began to map out my own emotions and needs more clearly, identifying what I could control and what required direct communication with Harper. The process was empowering, transforming passive frustration into deliberate contemplation, and laying the groundwork for the confrontation and decisive action that would follow. At the same time, external validation gave me perspective on Harper's behavior, not as justification but as understanding. I recognized that her withdrawal was likely influenced by stress, unspoken worries, or unmet emotional needs, and that acknowledging this complexity was critical for navigating the next steps. Friends and family reminded me that empathy did not require tolerance of emotional neglect. Rather, it was about balancing compassion with self-respect, a lesson that prepared me for the difficult conversations to come. By the end of that week, armed with multiple perspectives and the validation of those I trusted, I felt a renewed clarity about my next steps. I understood, perhaps more clearly than ever before, that the emotional patterns between Harper and me were unsustainable, and that addressing them head-on was unavoidable. The insights from friends, family, and colleagues provided both confirmation and courage, equipping me with the emotional framework to confront the reality of our disconnection. I could no longer ignore the mounting tension, nor could I passively wait for it to resolve itself. The external validation was the turning point, the signal that the moment for honesty, confrontation, and potential transformation had arrived. The realization came one rainy Thursday evening, a moment so sharp and unavoidable that it pierced through all the rationalizations I had been clinging to for weeks. Harper had been quiet all day, moving through our apartment with her usual efficiency but without the warmth that once accompanied every gesture. I had tried to engage her earlier, suggesting we watch a film or share a glass of wine, hoping to reclaim even a fragment of the intimacy that had defined our marriage. She had smiled faintly, but her eyes remained distant, distracted. It was then that she turned to me, breaking the silence, and casually asked, "Do you want to go out for date night tomorrow?" I froze, my stomach twisting. For weeks, intimacy had been denied, the emotional connection had been fraying, and now she was requesting an experience that I felt we were not ready to share. After a long pause, I responded with a single word: no. That simple refusal was not an act of anger nor a whim. It was the culmination of exhaustion, disappointment, and the stark recognition that the pattern of our marriage could no longer continue without fundamental change. The weight of that no hung in the air between us, dense and immovable. Harper's eyes widened slightly, not in shock, but in a subtle realization that something had shifted irreversibly. She didn't argue, didn't try to persuade me, and didn't retreat immediately. Instead, she studied me quietly, and I could see the questions forming in her gaze. The curiosity, the worry, and perhaps the dawning awareness that the boundaries I had silently set were unyielding. In that instant, I understood that this was not a temporary obstacle or a simple disagreement. It was the culmination of weeks of unmet needs, suppressed emotions, and unspoken tension. The emotional distance we had been ignoring had reached a tipping point, a moment where continuation without confrontation was no longer possible. I felt a strange mixture of relief and fear. Relief because I was finally asserting my own boundaries. Fear because I knew the next steps would be difficult, uncomfortable, and irrevocably defining. The following hours were spent in a tense quiet, both of us acutely aware of the emotional gravity of the moment. I retreated to the living room, seeking the solace of space, while Harper lingered in the kitchen, her presence near but separate. The sound of rain tapping against the windows mirrored the weight of the conversation we had not yet spoken, amplifying the sense of isolation and unresolved conflict. In that silence, I reflected on the weeks that had led us here. The small withdrawals, the clipped words, the lack of intimacy, and the erosion of emotional connection. Each memory accumulated like a ledger of unmet expectations, a record of the ways our marriage had slowly diverged from the closeness we once cherished. I realized that ignoring these problems, pretending they were temporary or inconsequential, had only allowed them to compound, making the eventual confrontation inevitable. It was in this quiet reflection that the final clarity emerged. I understood that the marriage I wanted, full of mutual respect, emotional connection, and physical intimacy, could not coexist with the patterns we had fallen into. The realization was both painful and empowering. Painful because it forced me to confront the fragility of our bond. Empowering because it illuminated the possibility of change if I acted decisively. I recognized that I had been complicit in sustaining the cycle of withdrawal by avoiding confrontation, rationalizing Harper's behavior, and suppressing my own needs. The responsibility was mutual, yes, but acknowledging my own agency was crucial. I could no longer passively endure emotional neglect or hope that the pattern would resolve itself. Action, however uncomfortable, was necessary. Harper eventually joined me in the living room, her movements tentative, reflective of the weight she too must have felt. We sat in silence for a long moment before I finally spoke, my voice measured but resolute. "Harper, this distance, the silence, the lack of connection, it can't continue like this." She nodded, a subtle acknowledgement, but remained quiet, as though preparing herself for what was to come. I continued, detailing the weeks of denial, withdrawal, and frustration, articulating feelings I had stored for too long. The words poured out, each one a piece of the emotional weight I had been carrying alone, yet now shared in the light of honesty. I explained the impact of her withdrawal on our intimacy, our communication, and the daily life that had once felt harmonious. There was no anger in my voice, no blame-laden accusations, only the raw articulation of truth, the delineation of the boundaries I could no longer compromise. It was then, in her listening, that the magnitude of the moment struck me. Harper's usual composure was disrupted by faint tremors in her hands, a subtle quiver in her lips, and eyes that glistened with restrained emotion. I saw, perhaps for the first time, that she too was grappling with the reality of what we had become. The silence that followed was heavy but pregnant with possibility. It was as if both of us understood that the denial and avoidance that had characterized the past weeks had reached its limit. The final realization, the rock bottom of our emotional struggle, was no longer an abstract concept. It was present, tangible, and unavoidable. We could either continue the cycle of disconnection or confront the difficult truths, taking responsibility for the state of our marriage and choosing a path toward clarity and potential restoration. In that moment, the gravity of our situation crystallized. Love alone was not enough. Intention, communication, and mutual accountability were necessary to rebuild the foundation we had allowed to erode. The emotional fatigue, the nights of silence, and the sense of invisibility I had endured were not signs of weakness, but signals that boundaries were being crossed, neglected, or ignored. And so, sitting across from Harper, I made a quiet but irrevocable decision. I would no longer accept passive withdrawal or unaddressed disconnection. The path forward would be difficult, uncomfortable, and requiring courage from both of us, but it was the only route that could preserve the integrity of our relationship and the dignity of our individual selves. That realization, the moment of clarity at rock bottom, was the turning point, the moment when hopelessness transformed into resolve, and the stage was set for the actions and decisions that would define the next chapter of our lives together. After the rock-bottom realization, the weight of weeks of silence, withdrawal, and emotional disconnection settled into a quiet determination within me. I knew that merely recognizing the problem would not be enough. The situation demanded action, deliberate and unflinching, because the bond Harper and I shared, precious and hard-earned, was at stake. The following morning, I woke with a resolve that felt both terrifying and liberating. I began by preparing for the conversation that I had postponed for far too long, organizing my thoughts, acknowledging my feelings, and anticipating the ways Harper might respond. I reminded myself that this was not about blame or punishment, but about reclaiming respect, connection, and the integrity of our marriage. For weeks we had drifted apart, and now, with clarity, I realized that boundaries needed to be set, accountability needed to be enforced, and honest dialogue needed to occur without deflection. The first step was to address Harper directly, in a space that allowed for focus and minimal distractions. I asked her to join me in our living room, where the morning light filtered through the curtains, softening the tension while illuminating the seriousness of the conversation. She arrived, cautious yet seemingly aware that something significant was about to unfold. I began by expressing my feelings candidly, choosing words that conveyed the depth of my hurt, frustration, and confusion, while also emphasizing that my goal was to rebuild the connection rather than dismantle it. "Harper," I said, voice steady but firm, "these past weeks have been incredibly difficult for me. The distance, the silence, and the lack of intimacy, it's more than I can ignore, and it cannot continue if we want this marriage to thrive." Her eyes widened slightly, not with anger but with an awareness that I was serious, that the decision to act was no longer negotiable. I laid out specific examples, not to attack, but to illustrate the pattern and its impact, the nights when she withdrew, the repeated avoidance of shared time, and the ways in which our communication had deteriorated. I spoke of the emotional toll, the loneliness, and the quiet frustration that had accumulated, making clear that these were not fleeting grievances but symptoms of a deeper problem. Importantly, I balanced honesty with empathy, acknowledging that her stress, workload, and personal pressures likely contributed to her behavior. I emphasized that my goal was not punishment, but clarity and resolution. The act of verbalizing these issues transformed the abstract tension into concrete reality, making it undeniable that inaction was no longer an option. Harper listened quietly, her initial defensiveness replaced gradually by a mixture of reflection and vulnerability. She admitted softly and haltingly that she had been overwhelmed, that work and personal expectations had consumed her attention, and that she had not realized the degree to which her withdrawal had affected me. Her admission was not a solution, but it was a bridge, a necessary acknowledgement that allowed us to move forward from avoidance into dialogue. I validated her feelings, affirming that stress and overwhelm were natural, while also making clear that mutual accountability and effort were non-negotiable in our marriage. This balance of compassion and firmness was essential. It conveyed love without enabling neglect, empathy without tolerance for inaction. From there, we began the execution of concrete steps. I proposed, and Harper agreed, that we would dedicate specific time each evening to reconnect, free from work distractions and external interruptions. We committed to open communication about stressors before they escalated, ensuring that emotional withdrawal would no longer go unnoticed or unaddressed. I suggested weekly date nights, emphasizing consistency rather than grandeur, and she agreed, recognizing that shared experiences were critical for emotional bonding. We also decided to establish clear expectations around intimacy, acknowledging that physical and emotional closeness were mutually reinforcing and necessary for the health of our relationship. These actions were deliberate, measurable, and enforceable, representing a practical roadmap for reversing the patterns that had led us to rock bottom. Implementation was challenging at first. Old habits are difficult to break, and both of us occasionally slipped into the familiar patterns of withdrawal and avoidance. Yet each time, the framework we had established provided a structure for accountability and reconnection. When Harper became preoccupied with work, I reminded her gently but firmly of our agreement. When I felt discouraged or distant, she reached out to reinforce our commitment. Slowly, the emotional distance began to shrink, replaced by intentional engagement, shared laughter, and honest dialogue. Intimacy returned, initially tentative but gradually natural, as the emotional walls between us dissolved. Each small success reinforced the larger goal, a marriage defined not by avoidance or resentment, but by conscious effort, mutual respect, and unwavering attention to each other's needs. By the end of that month, our home felt lighter, filled with the warmth, laughter, and connection that had been missing. Tasks were shared with renewed cooperation. Conversations flowed freely without fear of judgment or dismissal. Physical intimacy became a reflection of emotional closeness rather than a source of tension. We had reclaimed the partnership that had been threatened by weeks of silence, demonstrating to ourselves that honesty, accountability, and deliberate action could heal even the most corrosive patterns. The experience left an indelible mark on both of us, a reminder that love alone is insufficient, that boundaries are essential, and that relationships require vigilance, courage, and intentional effort to thrive. Ultimately, the difficult decision to say no in that moment, the refusal to comply with a superficial request for date night without addressing the underlying issues, was the catalyst that transformed despair into clarity. By taking action, articulating boundaries, and implementing concrete steps, we moved from a place of emotional depletion to one of partnership and resilience. Harper and I emerged not only reconciled but fundamentally strengthened, our relationship deepened by the trials we had endured, and fortified by the knowledge that honest confrontation, coupled with deliberate follow-through, can restore connection where neglect and avoidance once threatened to sever it entirely. That moment, that act of decisive action, became the turning point that saved our marriage and reaffirmed the principle that courage, clarity, and commitment are essential to sustaining love. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.